I'm Suzanne Mex. I'm the Managing Director for AIA New York, and I'm really excited to have you here for the first of our 3 sessions with our New Practices New York winners. The competition, of course, was held in January and February, and we've taken the time to get to know our winners and prepare this wonderful exhibition. So I hope you have time to look at it through it tonight, if not later in the run. Tonight's event is the first, where we'll be featuring the 2 winning firms, AUR and IGG, followed with a moderated discussion that will be moderated by Nahyun Hwang. This competition and the programming related to it would not be possible without the sponsorship of Aronson's Floor Covering and Basque Stone, who are our sponsor levels. We also have a supporter, Precise, and Precise will be hosting an event, virtual event later in the summer, which I hope you'll consider joining. The registration is live on the website, and we hope we'll see you there. But with that, I want to also really thank the drivers of our coordination on this event, Ryan Brooke-Thomas and Max Worrell, who are also the co-chairs of our New Practices Committee. They've really been the lifeblood to keep staff and our competitors ready to present all of this wonderful material. So with that, I'll pass over to Max and Ryan. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Suzanne.
Thanks, Suzanne.
Well, hey everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. We are the co-chairs of the New Practices Committee, which was established as a forum for new and evolving models of architecture and design practice. It was actually started in 2006 with the creation of the AIA New York New Practices Juried Portfolio Competition. So that really kind of kick-started what ultimately became the committee and a kind of community around that. But the competition itself looks to highlight and promote promising and innovative new architectural and design practices operating specifically in New York City. As the competition series has evolved, along with the community of practices who have been actively involved in the shared dialogue and other output of the committee over the years, it's also increasingly sought to establish a selection of practices who kind of together as a whole cohort demonstrate diverse and complementary ways of working, thinking, and designing. And then in the years between the competition cycles, we've also engaged in programming with lecture series, roundtables, shared discussions, site visits, et cetera, that help to focus the group both kind of looking inside and outside of our field to better explore multifaceted possibilities for architectural practice in the city. And so tonight we're excited to kick off the first of these 3 events featuring the 6 winning practices of the 2025 cycle. Tonight we've paired AUR and IGG, who will each be presenting work about their practice, followed by the shared conversation with past NPNI winner Nahyun Hwang of NHDM.
So a little bit of intro. I won't do too long, so we'll give a lot of time for the presentations, but IGG is going to go first. IGG is founded by Ignacio Galán, who's a New York-based architect, historian, and curator. As a practice, IGG seeks to contribute to the shaping of coalitions, both in its exploration of architecture as a mediator of diverse forms of interdependence, and in its operation through diverse forms of collaboration. AUR was founded in 2019 by Argo Jyoti. AUR is based both in New York City and New Delhi. Their work is embedded with narratives of cultural significance, social relevance, and environmental resilience, addressing all the crises of our times. They describe architecture as being perceived as a responsibility and history as an instrument to facilitate cultural continuity, social equity, and material specificity. So with that, let's welcome AUR. I'm sorry, IGG. Threw a curveball.
you so much for coming. Thank you also to the center, who has been such a gracious host for my work in the past also. So I'm very happy to be here. And thank you to the committee, to Ryan and Max for organizing this beautiful exhibition that I hope all of you can see. So I also want to thank the jury for putting out this kind of topic, voice, that I found very suggestive. And I want to start responding to the jury's prompt by reflecting on how I see the architect in relation to this topic. And I understand that architects have frequently advanced their voice in pursuit of authorial individuality, seeking to make unique contributions to culture. And alternatively, they've explored the relevance of their voice to advance images of redemption for different constituencies who often remain excluded from design debates. So I work as trying to craft an alternative to the figure of the isolated creator or the constitution of the architect as an external actor working from a position of ideological superiority, interested in contributing to the shaping of coalitions, as Max suggested, not singling out the architect's voice, but articulating it in new constructions of kinship. In advancing this project under the title Architecture's Kinship, I understand architecture as an enactment of complex social and environmental entanglements, not the container of pre-packaged relationships, but a medium for motley associations. And before I continue, I want to thank all the different individuals and collectives with whom I have collaborated in the different projects that I'm going to be showing and others that are in the show. Since these collaborations are one of the multiple scales in which these associations manifest, challenging the figure of the author as an isolated creator. And given the limited time we have, I'm going to jump right into one of the projects. And one consistent exploration in my work considers how architecture mediates different forms of gathering, new forms of support, and distinct positions within the environment. And I'm going to start with this project, which takes as its goal to shape a platform for empowering aging. The project hosts diverse forms of care across generations beyond the nuclear family, both within and outside the house, and furnishes technological and financial strategies supporting the life of its occupants. The project operates within a network of infrastructure, shaping a new, renewed social movement for aging in place that you see here, kind of featuring some Spanish news, countering the increasing isolation of older residents or their subjection to institutionalized forms of residence. The house is in an interesting neighborhood that mixes different types of residents, including some kind of older houses that are typically one floor, combined with some empty plots that are used as urban farming, and some newer rows of houses that are typically organized with a kind of main floor access through a steep stair with living quarters, and then, living rooms, and then a room with a floor with bedrooms in the upper floor. As an alternative to that strategy, going too fast. The project combines diverse living arrangements on each of its 3 floors with varying degrees of autonomy and interdependence between them. And while none of these 3 floors neatly responds to the needs of the hegemonic family that the other projects seem to represent, together they facilitate what I understand as kinship in the making. The first floor that you have in the center is accessed through a short ramp and contains a sequence of spaces for an aging couple with increasing mobility difficulties, including a bedroom, a bathroom, and a kind of small living room. Above, there is a floor prepared for the couple's frequent visits, including kind of friends and extended and chosen family that comes to visit. And in the lower level, you have an independent apartment with its own entrance, access also through a ramp and its own garden that the couple can rent to get financial resilience, or could be used in different systems of care, including programs that are currently being tested to combine students with older residents in pursuit of affordable housing, mutual care, and shared resources. And the proximity of the university city to this house kind of would facilitate a program like this. And while imagining these scenarios, the spatial organization of the project simultaneously allows for unprescribed futures that open up alternatives to constructed notions of the family house as an enclosed and stable social unit, while acknowledging the relations of dependency between the inhabitants and their social and material environments. There is a sequence of terrace. Sorry, the clicker goes back and forth. Sorry, so there's a cascading sequence of terraces that enhance a range of ecologies and activities hosted within the project, creating opportunities for socialization among the occupants of the residence and ground the house within diverse networks of the neighborhood. And one of the things that the project does is to privilege the front porch, the front terrace that is in communication with the street, instead of privileging the backyard, that is what most rows of houses do. And in this, it kind of learns from some of these smaller houses where you typically see older residents bringing the kind of their monoblock plastic chairs to the street in order to create some space of conviviality. So the house is neither nostalgic of all forms of sociality, nor does submit to the contemporary isolation of aging populations, but rather celebrates open and malleable linkages and affiliations. Finally, a number of interconnected formal and technological strategies favor the energy efficiency and environmental quality of the project. The house's complex volume allows for the majority of its rooms to open in more than one facade, facilitating cross-ventilation and natural cooling, which is enhanced by the staircase that you see here acting as a kind of natural chimney in the back. Combined with a rear ventilated curtain wall of rain screen ceramic cladding and corrugated steel panels, these systems ensure that no AC will be needed in the project, even in the extreme weather of Madrid. And these different strategies in that way are conceived as overlapping approaches to empowering the life of its aging occupants. Now, attention to the links that architecture mediates requires critical awareness of how architecture is also often involved in the division of communities, the disarticulation of cultural bonds, and the deterrence of solidarities. As it breaks as much as it sutures is how architecture mediates forms of kinship that I'm interested in exploring. And in mobilizing the term kinship, I'm aware that it is not a neutral term. In its normative use, it designates relationships confined within the family, and it's often a framework of patriarchal practices and discriminatory forms of care. Now, kinship is also mobilized to discuss shared ancestry and might also be linked to the nation as a naturalized framework of belonging. But I'm interested in how kinship also appeals to alternative forms of care and constructions of belonging amongst collectives typically excluded from the ontological and structural privileges offered by the family and the nation and spaces of care and belonging. So with attention to those concerns and advancing some of the questions concerning aging that I addressed in the previous project, I work on this other project titled Aging Against the Machine, that advocates for alternative housing scenarios and community development for aging that open up multiple options for care and strengthen community ties. In West Oakland, a culturally and racially diverse neighborhood, older residents are often faced with precarious living conditions as a result of decades of disinvestment in social programs and the legacies on redlining. But despite these challenges, residents are working together to resist predatory real estate practices and advance the common good. In fact, the area has long been a testing ground for civil rights movements and counterculture communities from historical Black Panthers programs and work inspired by the Center for Independent Living Resources for People with Disabilities to the ongoing community development projects that are being developed in the neighborhood. So our project doesn't shape ungrounded visions of redemption for these residents, but rather hopes to make visible, connect, and expand local initiatives and build, and it's built in solidarity with the voices of local residents that were engaged in participatory workshops, unfolding through an intersectional community-based approach to aging in response to the way in which architecture has also historically supported the undoing of social bonds and the erasure of shared histories in this neighborhood. Now, I understand design processes and their multiple mediators as embedded within diverse negotiations, conflicts, and coalitions, as I've already mentioned. And with projects like these, I seek to challenge the coherence provided by authorial autonomy and technocratic authority, and instead emphasize the different actors and distributions of agency involved in architectural production, nurturing forms of practice that result from fluid platforms of collaboration of diverse teams and forms of expertise. So the different strategies we proposed in coalition with that work included building on the work of Moms for Housing, a West Oakland collective of homeless and marginally housed mothers that fights to reclaim vacant investor-owned properties. And we imagine building a new West Oakland Community Land Trust to acquire similar sites using city funding, credit union loans, and donations, and in that way countering ongoing gentrification. This would allow neighbors to stay in West Oakland as they grow older. We imagine local development corporations like Ebalsi, with which we work, collaborating with the CLT to continue their work in building projects in vacant lots, and here you have one of the models that you have in the exhibition, actually. Amongst those projects, we imagine housing offering opportunities for collective affiliations across generation, including also caregivers and their families with more traditional housing units and others where social life happens in certain spaces. We also imagined building on programs like those developed by the Black Panthers to build a series of community vans providing care in the community, as well as the construction of elevated porches shared by different units. And here we were building on knowledge generated by the Center for Independent Living, some kind of blocks up in Berkeley that were developing these instructions for the construction of ramps. And we imagine that these porches facilitate access to households, which are typically accessed in the second floor through these kind of steep stoops, but also create spaces of conviviality for neighbors. And we hope that these spaces could facilitate the construction of cooperatives amongst the individual households as a long-term strategy for shared building maintenance, economic resilience, and mutual care. Lastly, we imagine transformations of the building stock to make it more resilient to the needs of diverse groups, both materially as well as environmentally and financially. And with projects like these, I'm interested in building community around design, both through the different platforms of collaboration and engaging the work of different collectives in the understanding of my practice as resulting from manifold forms of comraderiness. And just as I work in different platforms of collaboration, I've also developed projects that seek to support diverse coalitional pursuits by shaping platforms in which unfamiliar intimacies can be shaped. This loft renovation in Williamsburg, called Another Seedbed, seeks to build a new node in the cultural fabric of New York City. This project offers a space to live, work, and host artists to develop their work, countering the tendency towards normative domesticities that characterize current trends in the renovation of former industrial spaces, and alternatively seeks to strengthen existing social networks. Performance artists operating in lofts in New York and other post-industrial cities in the 1960s to the 1980s systematically challenged the constructions of intimacy and disrupted established notions of property and ownership, and such challenges would question the ideology of domesticity and conventional valuations of a space. And we wanted to build in this work in alliance with the intentions of the owner and activator of the space that had began organizing parties, performances, and other events in his previous home, an old industrial space in Bushwick. And he imagined that he wanted to have a space in which he could live, work as an artist, but also host other artists and friends to develop their work. So the project is neither a private studio nor an art gallery, but it's rather equipped to welcome gatherings that operate between a dinner party and a public performance. Artists appropriate the space and become hosts themselves, expanding the communities which the project brings together. A number of volumes in red stained pine plywood, hand-trowel earthen clay plaster, color MDF, and backlit smoked polycarbonate with colored wood frames and a host of moving furniture articulate these encounters and choreograph the boundaries of kinship that the project negotiates. The space is already operating and does not advertise its performance. Some neighbors don't know that it exists. Others go often to events in this space, and some have found themselves building networks of neighborliness within it, ultimately crafting alternative forms of kinship. So some of my projects have been interested also in exploring and communicating rather than necessarily intervening in the way in which, in negotiating different forms of kinship, architecture mediates different battlegrounds. And that's the case of this exhibition designed for the Venice Biennale, which explores restrooms as one of those contested spaces that both shape and are shaped by the ways bodies and communities come together. Architectures where, in this case, gender, religion, race, disability, hygiene, health, and environmental concerns, and the economy are defined culturally and articulated materially. These battlegrounds address the struggle of transgender high school student Gavin Grimm, who filed a lawsuit against the Gloucester High School's discriminatory policy that forced him to use an isolated restroom in a retrofitted janitor's closet rather than sharing the communal facility with his male classmates. Represented in these kinds of dioramas that you have in the lower left, another of such battlegrounds includes the work of female activist Lee Macy with her Occupy Men's Restroom movement, in which some 20 women took over male public restrooms in Guangzhou and Beijing to fight for potty parity. Another one is the battle of a disabled individual and his mother and attendant, Jacqueline, who have been struggling with the use of restrooms in hotels in Colombia, where they reside, and they have to travel often due to Jacqueline's activism. The generic technical and spatial solutions of these facilities contrast with the personalized retrofits that you see in the model that they've built in their own domestic bathroom to accommodate their specific practices of care. We also discussed the case of a prison in the United Kingdom where the Muslim population that is detained there requested the addition of latrines and footbaths to accommodate their cultural and religious practices. And we addressed the battle that unleashed when some radical Christian groups protested what they saw as a threat to the fabric of Western society, a threat that these bathrooms in their mind enacted. Another case considers environmental battlegrounds mediated by architecture, considering, for example, how the lack of public restrooms in Haiti was exacerbated in the form of a crisis by the 2010 earthquake, which destroyed much of Port-au-Prince's water management and sewage infrastructure. In fact, I'm interested in the way in which architecture is not only entangled in mediating constructions of kinship amongst humans, but also shapes ecosystems that bring together otherwise independent organisms. And this is something that I've explored more specifically in installations like the Restroom Pavilion, built simultaneously in Venice. And in this case, these kind of one-to-one transformation of a bathroom explore the networks of bodies, infrastructures, ecosystems, cultural norms, and regulations that are materialized by bathrooms in Venice. While restrooms' material and aesthetic definitions typically work to sustain modern and contemporary ideals of hygiene, within this project, we wanted to provide an inclusive description of the realities within which restrooms exist. The architecture of restrooms in Venice depends, for example, on a hidden network of underground brick tunnels constructed beginning in the 16th century called the Gattoli, which supported the development of humanist ideals of hygiene by which waste would need to be excluded from the spaces of human coexistence. The expansive use of domestic technologies and the massification of tourism in the 1960s and onwards led to the ecosystemic transformation of the lagoon, and the city started then to implement the use of portable septic tanks like the ones you have in the image, which temporarily store and treat human waste and need to be regularly emptied using portable containers to carry them away from the city as a form of kind of outsourcing of shit. While architecture is often committed to mystifying these entanglements, we imagine that it could make them present through new forms of decoration. So instead of kind of the white tiling that covers the pipes that make all these kind of performances and environmental agreements possible, we propose this new bathroom decoration. But we also intervene in the way in which bathrooms tend to segregate bodies and substituted the typical bathroom signage with a number of flags that announce different entanglements of restrooms in lieu of enacting established forms of segregation. And we were interested in the way in which those segregations, including the gender division of restrooms, is coordinated with other structures that reinforce binaries governed by patriarchal systems, including those of the gondolas that circulate through Venice's canals and only admit male gondoliers. We, in the bathroom, celebrated the figure of transgender gondolier Alex Hay, who has challenged that structure. In the restroom, we argued we always live together, and we wanted the project to celebrate that. And in this last project, I want to show you, I have been interested in the ways in which humans and non-humans are connected, not just within, but also through architecture and the territories involved in its construction and operation. This project is located in a pine tree forest that is engaged with an extractive history, as it's announced by a significant watchtower designed by Gustave Eiffel's workshop in the late 19th century and built when the forest was used for resin exploitation. These extraction campaigns tend to lean towards monocultures and the impoverishment of the ecosystem, and the tower is emblematic of the forms of technical expertise favored at the time and the understanding of nature as a distinct and outer reality to be contemplated and surveilled in order to be exploited. So the project I'm showing you, Camp Accomplices, rehearses an alternative relation to the forest which, countering the logic of the watchtower, cultivates different and overlapping forms of cohabitation within diverse environmental entanglements. While formalized as a compact volume to reduce heat transfers in a rather extreme weather with very cold winters and hot summers in the mountains close to Madrid, the project is characterized by its mediated porosities, spatially and materially, its geometry providing each room with access to windows in at least two facades, just like the project I showed at the beginning, to ensure multiple sources of light and facilitate natural ventilation. And again, it uses a similar construction system with rear ventilated curtain wall tile facade with rain screen green ceramic cladding and metal roof that delaminates the enclosure as a simultaneous strategy of thermal control and environmental integration. A large veranda that you see here wrapping around the project towards the south creates an additional environmental buffer while constituting the main space of socialization in contact with forms of life that surround the house. And rather than peeking over the arboreal mass in a panoptical pursuit, the veranda occupies the richness of this area within the section of the forest, with the arboreal mass kind of creating the conditions necessary for different forms of life to flourish beneath the canopy of the trees. The characteristic porosity of the project and its entanglement with the ecosystem are also materialized in an experimental permeation of the water management systems. So in the absence of sewage infrastructure, houses in this area typically depend on closed systems with septic tanks with the segregation of different types of water. What we try to do in this project is to minimize the amount of fluid captured as waste in the septic tank and diverse most of the water in what we conceptualize as a process of untanking, temporarily stored in a series of ventilated filtered tanks. This water enters an open system, including a pond, and is ultimately reintroduced into the environment. Ponds are often disrupted by architectural structures and are an essential feature of the ecosystem of local forests, concentrating diverse forms of animal and plant life. And in this case, the new porous water management system is crucial to the diversification of the ecosystem, which was damaged by extractivist strategies. And what we've done is to add around the house a number of pollinating plants, although they are still recently planted. These photographs don't show what we hope will be happening, and will hopefully attract an ecology of insects and support the richness of the ecosystem. Of particular importance is the recuperation of amphibian life also around the pond, including frogs, which are not only essential to the life of the black stork and the imperial eagle that are protected species in the area, but are also linked to the memories of the residents of the house that remember going to the mountains and playing with frogs when they were kids. And in these different strategies of porosity and permeation seek to support the residents to build alliances amongst the forms of life that share the site with them, favoring the same ingenuity and curiosity that define the ethos of summer camps. So I'll leave it there, and just to summarize, I work through design and curatorial projects, built and speculative platforms, practice and research, with the goal of participating in critical, even if sometimes messy, coalitions with the hope of questioning exclusionary forms of affiliation, ultimately hoping to contribute to the imagining of alternative platforms of relatability through the exploration, discussion, activation, and transformation of the built environment. Thank you very much.
Which one's the clicker? This one. That's back. And what's this? That'll exit outdoors. Oh, backward. There's a laser pointer on top. Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming. Just a brief introduction about our practice. We are between New York and New Delhi, and we are a group of 15 architects. I spend time between both Delhi and New York, and we are working on more medium-scale cultural projects in India and in the US. We are working on residential projects. So what we will do, the categorization of the projects would be, you can say, more geographical. It'll be, we'll talk about the projects in the US first, take a short trip to China, and then mostly focus on projects in India. Regarding the title of the presentation, we, of course, the theme for this year's competition was voice, and we spoke about being a voice for the other, and AUR in Hindi is It signals a prompt, but it also signifies the other. But we are interested in this notion of temporality. And when we say what time is this place, what we essentially mean is that developing an architecture that is cognizant of the place, but it's also cognizant of the time without doing a mimicry of the past, but be heavily influenced by history. We talk about an architecture of temporal continuity while creating a dialogue with history embedded in narratives of cultural significance, social relevance, and environmental resilience. For us, Max read out the brief, I won't dwell on it much, but for us, architecture of material and memory that crafts histories of the future, thoughtfully excavating histories of the past. We are living in a time when social and environmental crises demand immediate action. We are working on several projects that deal with social and environmental issues, but more powerfully or more strongly, we feel that the cultural crisis remains a more pressing issue. Across the world, we are seeing this politically, where there's a collective amnesia with the erasure of shared memory. Architecture, of course, remains a highly political act, and the production of space gets contested through the forces of migration, labor, climate, and colonialism. We are interested in histories and archaeologies, community and social equity, and craft and materiality. We try to work with communities that have a long evolved sense of craft and materiality and contribute to their sense of history. I'll start with a project in Berkeley that this didn't get built, but these are called Vedanta societies. These are a group of spiritual institutes that were built across the world, mostly in the United States. And the image on the right is the center in Calcutta, and the image on the left is the center in Berkeley that was built right during World War II. And during the 60s, where the development of the hippie movement in Bay Area, this was an active center, both in Berkeley as well as in San Francisco, where exposure to Eastern religions and spirituality was always in the center line of the hippie movement. That's the existing building. What we were tasked to do was to document the existing structure, which is a prayer hall inside, and a couple of rooms for 2 monks to reside. The monks manage this place. They have sermons. This is less religious, but more spiritual. They have sermons every Sunday, and we were tasked to design a dining hall for the monks for their Sunday gatherings. The structure on the right is the dining hall that we added. It's a simple structure that aligns with the main church, if you call it. What we decided to do is develop a very simple structure that when at the very low point, it touches the low point of the existing structure, and at the high point, it touches the high point of the main structure, and there's a tower which sits taller than that, creating this double curved surface, and clad it with these Spanish tiles. That's a structure on the left that you see. The low point of the roof towards the right is the low point of the existing structure. And we wanted to create a simple gesture. As you saw in the first image, the original typology that was developed in Kolkata had a different kind of architecture, but the question was, what should we do here that would sit well with the context, sit well with the existing building? And so that's a very, very simple structure that is a homogeneous structure with Spanish tiles. That's the interior of the structure. There are 4 long tables for dining during the Sunday sermon gatherings. While we are in Berkeley, we'll quickly go to Oakland, where we designed a very small house that was the back lot of an existing house. The house was around 1,250 square feet. We started by looking at the typology of roofs in the landscape of Oakland, and from the A-frames to different kinds of roof forms. We started developed several studies, and we came up with this design that sat well at the end of a dead-end street with a weathered wood exterior. And skylights at the top of the building. These are some built images of the skylight and the staircase leading you up to the top floor. There is a social foundation in San Francisco that had reached out to us to develop their office in their garage. And the Bay Area is not stranger to garage offices. We have Google, we have Apple, we have garage offices everywhere across the country where there was this focus on frugality when they started out a business. I think this is something that's not happening anymore, but it was a very interesting proposition to work with them. That's the garage. So they have a great view of, it's on the top of a hill that has great views of San Francisco. This is, for those of you familiar with San Francisco, this is in Dolores Park, Dolores Heights. So from Dolores Heights, you get a view of downtown. And internally, we are also able to get a glimpse that we started working with industrial materials like metal chain curtains to hide their storage spaces and mechanical spaces that were behind. These were some of the images from the project. We have been doing several projects in Manhattan in residential renovation, where the image on the left is one of the first pull-down beds, and the image on the right is one of the earliest sliding doors. I feel our projects here have been about increasing housing stock from 2-bedroom to 3-bedroom, or 1-bedroom to 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom to 4-bedroom. And the elements to be used have been pull-down beds and sliding doors. I feel these two elements that are very integral to the history, and I mean, similar things have developed also in Hong Kong, but these are some images of one of our recent projects. This is right next to the UN. We are in conversation with a Sikh temple, a Gurdwara in Glen Cove, Long Island, to develop a language school at their top floor. This building has a very interesting history. It was built in the 1850s as a private residence, and it expanded over time. And at every time, the use changed. It started off being a private residence. It became a geoconference center. It became, and finally ended up being a Sikh temple in late 90s, in 1997. I think the images are burning out a little bit, but these are some of the old drawings that we found from the city archives of the building in different stages of its history. I'll just quickly move through to the project. What we wanted to do is create this corridor. If you see the Wamsai axon, it's a little burnt out. Create this corridor that connects all the classrooms, that connects the a gallery space. This becomes a gallery space that will have murals and paintings on the right. And these corridors open into classrooms on either side. And at the very end, there's a social gathering space with a larger classroom. In end of 2019, right when I started AUR, we started working on a project in Wuhan, of all places. We didn't know what was to come. It was a technology campus, and we looked into the history of Wuhan and the wetlands that Wuhan has. And a lot of 50% of the wetland in the past 30 years have been lost to construction. So we created a campus that was set around wetlands, but also that used local brick and terracotta to create the facade and the building exterior. We worked on 2 projects, both of which didn't go into fruition, but I think it was a great experience of, and the other was also a technology village that we set up. So that's the Yellow Crane Tower in Wuhan. That's the first project that developed a building exterior, a tower with that was to be used for office spaces for technology companies, and then there was a residential and retail component associated with it. We created this pagoda tower typology that is highly contemporary, but it evokes a certain continuation of the region's history by using a cultural motif that's very prominent to Wuhan. We will start talking about the project that's being exhibited in the exhibition. We have been interested in migration and labor, and we'll demonstrate that through some of the projects that we will show. Migration, forced or voluntary, has shaped human history. Built environment, language, food, music, clothing have been hybridized. We all inhabit the third space. Labor, forced or voluntary, and its relationship with production has defined local and global economies. Understanding subaltern spaces in contemporary cities gives us a lens into the evolution of geographies and culture to further project such spaces of normative living into the future. We have exhibited a bottle of sugar there that's from Jamaica. Against all accepted opinion that slavery, transatlantic slavery, started with cotton, it started with sugar in the Caribbean. Sugar was transported via the trade routes to Egypt from India, and that's how it entered Europe. People loved sugar in their tea, and according to historian William Dalrymple, we got into the business of dehumanizing people just because people loved sugar in their tea. This is Calcutta in the 1800s. After 200 years of transatlantic slave trade, in the 1830s, this transatlantic slave trade was abolished in the British Empire. And a new system of labor supply was devised, which would get indentured laborers from Calcutta in eastern India and Madras, now Chennai, in southern India, as well as Guangdong in China, and supply labor in existing European settlements across the world, mostly the British Empire, in South Africa, Mauritius, the Caribbean. These are images from inside the indenture ships, and the ones on the left are the living conditions underneath in the hull of the ship. When slavery was abolished, a lot of the slave ships that were decommissioned were put to use to get labor from India and China and transport them to Guyana, Suriname, and all these places. So the new museum project that we are doing is that's starting construction this year. It is a bunch of existing industrial structures that we are reusing, doing some retrofitting work, and the exterior of the museum is indexing of the interior of these ships where the laborers were transported from India all the way to other colonies. Mauritian writer Kola Torabuli talks about a triad of identities. He talks about an identity of these laborers when they were living in their villages where they were taken from, and he talks about the transition across the water for 3-4 months, finally when they arrive in the new land. So that's the second identity, and by the time they arrive, they create a new identity. unlike the dehumanization of the slave trade, people were not in shackles, but the loss of memory that people had was a big loss, and how people have preserved these cultures in the Caribbean and other parts of the world are the things that we are exhibiting inside this museum, along with Kolkata Port's built heritage. So these are living structures for these indentured laborers who would work the sugarcane fields initially, and then slowly it evolved into tobacco and cotton, mainly in southern USA. The image on the extreme left is in South Africa. When Gandhi was in Africa, one of his first social causes, I mean, he initially was a person who supported the British Empire in India, but his first social cause was working as a lawyer for these indentured laborers who are being denied their basic rights. The middle image is in Guyana, which is a house built right in the middle of the sugarcane fields. And the image on the right is in Mauritius, where people lived in barracks, where 5 to 6 families would live in a single barrack. We spent a year on studying these very normative typologies of housing for these indentured laborers. And we also looked into, these are different housing conditions across 4 countries, 8 countries, and we looked at multiple typologies across. These were their workplaces. Sorry, the image is a little burnt out, but these are the factories and the sugar mills where the indentured laborers worked in. They are across Mauritius, South Africa, Reunion, Guyana, Suriname, Fiji. Our current site, our current project is at a site with a very deep history of indenture trade. This was the site from where ships, where people would get on small boats, where laborers who would sign off these agreements would come and be set up in a hold area, and they would get on the ships that would sail. The ship would be right in the middle of if you see the image on the right, you see the Hooghly River that was a major conduit for transportation of workers from northern provinces into Calcutta, and from where they would board on these ships. So this was a dry dock. There's an existing structure. There's an existing structure that we are maintaining. There's one structure that does not, we are replacing that with a new structure. But we started looking at the materiality of the site and leaned towards the weathering and decay of materials, because the decay and weathering of materials and also of the history is quite evident when you visit the site. And we started working with weathered steel. One sample has been exhibited in the exhibit. The facade that we are developing would be built with weathered steel, not as a stylistic statement, but more as a very relevant material that would suit the site, but also the conceptual narrative of the project. That's the site when you're seeing it from the road. We are maintaining, the strange thing in working on a bunch of these adaptive reuse projects is that a lot of these things were designed in the 1800s by people who we do not call architects, and their sense of space, their sense of alignment between volumes is amazing. And we often undermine normative, banal spaces, but what we have learned is that there's a lot that we can take forward in creating architecture. That's the internal space, that's the dry dock. Those were concrete benches that were there, and the ships would come in, people would get on, that's the middle rail. We are preserving the rail, we are redoing a bunch of things. And we're preserving the truss system on top, and the museum is a set of these galleries that you meander through this double height space, and there's a space underneath that will act as an amphitheater. So that's the facade, and when you look at the exterior, it's a big part of it is a solid exterior with some glazing. The solid exterior follows the dimension of the units of sleeping, the sleeping quarters that were underneath. It was 5 foot, 5 foot by 16 inches. That's what they were given, and you saw it in one of the earlier images. So we have these ensemble of 3 volumes, and the only thing we did is work out the spaces, but the volumes were generated from the existing structures from the site. And we felt that it was a powerful space. No one would think of this as architecture with a capital A, but I think the proportions and the connection between these volumes were amazing. So we had a great ground to start from. The volume on the left is where you enter, and you get into this double height space, and then there's a gallery on top, and that connects you to this volume, from this volume to this volume. This is a volume that you can peek into from the galleries. This is where the library and the museum store is, and you basically enter and exit through the same space. You form a loop and then you exit. That gives you an idea of how the interior spaces are laid out. These are the 3 volumes coming together, weathered steel volumes. This is towards the front of the museum that faces the river. You have glazing so that you can look into the river, as well as you can look into an old ship from the 1800s that the port had and has been installed there. Talking about migration and working with oral histories, we have been engaged with a couple of nonprofit organizations, one called 1947 Partition Archive, for which we have done several exhibits, one in Delhi and one in Berkeley. And then we have been working with Kolkata Partition Museum Trust to develop a virtual curated space, a museum, if you may, for these oral histories. So post-World War II, there were multiple partitions across the world. There was India being split into India and Pakistan, and East Pakistan, which later became Bangladesh. But there was also the split of British Palestine. And if you look at these territories, and if you look at the geopolitical context of the world today, there are 2 wars going on, one in Palestine and Israel, and one that was about to be a war and has been curtailed for the time being, but also at the border between India and Pakistan. These are some images from the refugee settlements outside of Calcutta, and the image on the very right are mansions that were left behind by refugees when they were forced to flee. I'm from Calcutta, but my family originally was from Dhaka, so we have this dual identity across the border. This image on the left shows India at the peak of the empire. It was the region in orange are the places that were under British control. And when the British left, these imaginary lines were drawn based on demographics and religion, and which caused the split, which caused people to move across that border. For those of you who don't know, this was the largest forced migration in human history. About 15 million people crossed. It was more than the transatlantic slave trade, which by historians' count is at 12.5 million. This was 15 million people, 2 million people get killed in the genocide. And what these organizations have done is archive some of the memories by the Oral History Project that they run. The image on the right is New Delhi, how it has developed over time and how it has changed based on refugee colonies. So if you look at Delhi, Delhi and Calcutta are refugee cities with a lot of refugee neighborhoods that were set up post-World War II, post-partitioning of India. Partition is a testimony to the irrationalities of empire and all imperial regimes, which often ruptures community evolution, distorts historical trajectories, and forces violent state formations from societies that otherwise would have taken different and unknowable paths. Partition is a permanent message of the jeopardies of the imperial rule and the responses of extreme nationalism. We have realized that the museum, the Typology Museum as a construct is a colonial concept. I mean, there were museums, many museums before, but the modern museums as we know it. So what we thought of through this organization is, can we highlight stories of people who are at the fringes, subaltern, as has been used, the term subaltern has been used, refugees who have moved between India and Bangladesh multiple times with the formation of Bangladesh, and then they have, so I helped archive some of these interviews and curate the oral history project. We created a virtual space where that talks about the material history of the region of Bengal and also highlights the oral histories inside these projects. You can navigate through the space. While we are in Bengal, I will I'll quickly talk about this project that we have been working on. This is a region called Sundarbans. This is between India and Bangladesh. This is a place where the Royal Bengal tiger is originally from. It's the world's largest network of deltas where the major rivers of the Indian subcontinent meet the ocean. But it's also a place which is at the forefront of climate change, and climate change not as something we as something that we are looking into the future might happen. This is something that the communities are facing with every passing day. They are losing land every passing day, and yearly this region also gets. It's a beautiful region with rice paddy fields, with ponds and coconut trees, but it's also a region that has been ravished by cyclones. So this was in 2020 when we started, right at the peak of COVID, when this region, the villagers, moved to cities in India to work as laborers. And right when this was happening, there was a reverse migration back to the villages because people didn't have work. A major cyclone hit, and there was this dual disaster that happened for the people of these villages. We started working with another NGO that have been working with these communities, and we realized that the success of any social project is a sense of belonging, is a sense of trust that they need to put on us, because people look at you with suspicion when, I have grown up in the region, I speak the language, but we have worked with tribal communities whose language I don't speak, so having that trust is super important. So we started looking at interviewing people and understanding how their existing structures were failing and understanding how the lateral force of wind and water could be better restored. Roots of climate change can be traced to colonialism and the attitude of endless resource extraction. Vulnerable communities facing environmental crisis in its immediate present and not the future question the fundamentals of shelter and its permanence. We developed a prototype for a house that was raised off the ground that would help during the floods. Across the border, that river splits India and Bangladesh, so that vegetated field that you see beyond mangrove forest, that's Bangladesh on the other side. And then we started working with the Munda tribal community. They are originally from central India. They were brought to the Sundarbans to cut down forests in the mid-1850s by the colonists. And since then, they have been living there, but they have always been living in the fringes. They are the subaltern of the subaltern. The poor Bengali people also mistreat them. They have a different language. They cannot speak the language, so there's a bias that is set in these villages. So we did a couple of workshops with these women to to understand what needed to be built, and we developed these prototypes for a health center and a school that would also serve as a shelter when there's a storm. And luckily, this structure is far away from the edge of land, so you don't see that. So we devised this bamboo and concrete hybrid construction system that the lower part would have rebars, and then as we go up, it transitions into bamboo reinforcement and a completely bamboo structure. I think this project has been a lot about, compared to other projects where we are able to really get hands-on involved, this project has been a lot about letting go of things. Like you design a certain things, but what we question what drawings, the value of drawings, because if we drew something and if people are not able to read on the site, it's completely useless. And there are moments where there are interventions done by the craftsmen that we didn't intend to do. And initially, as as a mainstream, I would say, like the way we have been trained as architects, you are not able to accept that. But I think the best thing is about knowing when to accept and knowing how to bring the community together in doing these projects. Because we don't specialize in this. We jumped right in with another nonprofit organization. These were the bamboo columns and beams where we developed these with a structural engineer. The structure is 80% complete. The NGO is raising. We got a award, India Humanitarian Hub Award from London, from the START Network. We used all the funds to build the project, but we ran out. The NGO is, the not-for-profit is raising funds to complete the project. This is the veranda we created that would overlook the paddy fields. And these were rooms that would the rooms would be patient rooms that would overlook into the green of the paddy fields as well as the coconut trees beyond. Since then, we have started working with several NGOs that are doing more mainstream projects. This is an NGO called High Five Foundation. They are out of California, and they're building a sports academy for slum kids and tribal kids. So we visited a lot of these centers, schools where they run sports programs in Mumbai, in areas where there are immediate slums. So they would work with children from those communities and use sports as a device for their social development and progress in life. We are working in a region of the Western Ghats, which has a lot of native volcanic rocks. So these are some stone quarries about 2 kilometers from the site. I'm sorry, I'm using kilometers. I flip-flop between the two 10 times a day when we are working on projects. That's the overall campus where the first 2 buildings, I'm going to rush a little bit. We are running out of time. That's the arenas that we are building. The residential dorms or hostels, as we call them, are there. That's the prayer hall right in the middle. That's the dining. We created this central social space where people could come together. The kids could come together. There's an amphitheater. And the slope of the land, the landscape has been used to develop a project that creates these visual corridors for outdoor sport events. This is currently under construction as we speak. We are doing foundation work in Mumbai. I'm just going to quickly go through the slides. That shows the exterior wall system that was a hybrid between stone masonry construction and steel HSS structures. That's the street that we created between the 2 arenas that we envision as an active street when they have tournaments, sport tournaments of these kids and other kids that would come and visit from across India at this center. That's the interior space. We created padding on the surfaces on the interior so that the children don't get hurt while they're playing. So it's a different materiality, but of the stone that's been restricted to the interior. The interior has been a smooth finish and a softer finish for the ground floor. These are the hostels or the dormitories where kids would be living. That's the spaces of living are centered around courtyards, 2 courtyards for each hostel, and where they could play, they could have performances. That's the prayer hall right in the middle of the project. So we are using basalt rock in 3 different ways. This is more a gabion wall with the previous one was coast masonry, and the first one was random rubble. This is from last month. We worked with the World Bank on several projects, several cultural projects. I'll quickly go over this. This was the highlighted area in red, and that's the Taj Mahal. We are developing a center for living traditions for artisans and craftsmen, for craft forms that are being lost, like marble inlay work, embroidery, and other things. We did several workshops with these women and men who are working in these craft forms, and to understand their needs and to understand how they are currently working and how they could reappropriate the spaces that we will design. So they were an active participant in the design process. These are some products that have been created. So we are, the first image showed Taj Mahal as well as it showed Fatehpur Sikri, two very different typologies. One is about the grandeur, the other one is about the human scale pavilions. What we attempted to do is a pavilion, a set of pavilions across a very highly dense forested area that borrows from the Islamic architecture but uses it in a way that it develops a dialogue with the old without doing a mimicry with the old. So there's a 4-point arch that we used as a section profile. That's the entrance to the campus where you have the marketplaces. Those are the marketplaces. And then behind there's a village of pavilions for the people to work. So at night, just based on the geometry with the recessed columns with the uplighter, you're able to generate an arch, a shadow arch, just based on the profile of the exterior. That's the village where it has screened walls for people to walk. These are the workspaces where tourists would come and see what they're producing. Another project that's being exhibited there, we'll quickly touch on. This is the Buddhist Circuit project with the World Bank, where we were involved in Sarnath and a couple of other places. But the project that you see is in Lumbini, the birthplace of that's the master plan that was done by Kenzo Tange in the 70s. And like all master plans, it's highly disruptive. It disrupted existing communities, moved them away, and to create this perfect geometry, right? And we were lucky for the World Bank to get back to us to work on this project that created a cafe for pilgrims using one of the pavilions that's in a slight state of disrepair to be run by local rural women from the same villages that got displaced. That's Kenzo Tange on an elephant back. He's visiting South Asia, of course. An elephant has to be there to survey the huge campus that he was working on. These are some isometric. I'll just be very quick. Some initial renderings of the project in construction, some of the images of the project. I'll get to the topic of adaptive reuse. We are doing several projects on adaptive reuse, and I feel adaptive reuse is, at its very onset, it's not only environmentally conscious, it's not an environmentally conscious approach only, it helps preserve cultural histories of a region and narratives of people and places that run the risk of being lost in a collective amnesia. So there's this community of traders from Rajasthan in the west of India, which is where the Indian desert is. In a very arid region, they moved away for business opportunities in other colonial centers. So Calcutta was coming up as a colonial center, Mumbai was coming up. So they migrated to these communities and set up as enormously successful business communities across India, and and across the world. And they built, but they back home in their native place, they built these mansions which were mandated not to be grander than the mansions or the palaces of the royalty. So these were built in masonry work, plastered on. So I'll be quick. Where we are working with a really amazing contractor. We are working with limestone. These are some of the frescoes. This region is really known for its frescoes on the facade as well as on the interior. So we're developing this into a hotel, a heritage hotel. I won't go into the plan, but these are some of the images that we developed while understanding the project, what to preserve, which paintings to preserve. The materiality of all new construction is in limestone, and we are using lime plaster and lime putty to repair the existing structures. So these are some. We are about to start construction on this one. We are using lime plaster and lime putty, and I discovered that's a new structure that has been added in limestone that follows the geometry, but in a very minimal extension of the existing geometries. There's a very interesting material property of lime plaster that we discovered is that lime plaster, when it works with water and you apply it, chemically it becomes calcium carbonate. I think that's limestone. I wasn't good in chemistry, but it becomes limestone. So lime plaster treated with water laid out on the surface becomes limestone. So through this project, we were able to create this dialogue between lime plaster and limestone, which is available in the region. That's the extension of the Haveli that an additional room is being added that's being done in limestone. We were very nervous, I should say I was very nervous of using green because there is the color green in the existing Haveli, but we really like it the way it is turning out to be. We are selecting the pigments. So this is a colonnaded suite, that's an arch suite. I'm going to end almost there, the last couple of slides. So also in the same region, we have been working on another project that I'll just show a couple of slides. This is one of the Havelis or the mansions of Shekhawati, which is known for these frescoes on the facade. And it also has this repetition or the rhythm of these brackets on the facade. And you see these brackets transnationally in Europe. You see it even if you go walk around Soho, you look at the top of the buildings, you see these repetitive brackets. We thought that there was some beauty in that repetition. And we are working on a new ground-up structure that is completely out of limestone, also in the same region, that uses limestone in multiple finishes. The interiors are finished with lime plaster, but uses different finishes of limestone to create a homogeneous facade that sits with the history of the region, with buildings neighboring palaces like these. I would end with that and say every material has memory. We create meaning when we are able to connect the story of the material with the story of the place and the people. Thank you. Thank you all for listening.
Okay, so I believe we have 30 minutes. Ryan, I don't know where Ryan is. Wanted to ask, should he reduce it or do the 30 minutes?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think we until 8.
Okay. So thanks so much for amazing presentations and really provoking works, both of you. I'm so happy to be discussing, having this discussion with you both and also the audience. So we're going to try to touch upon some of the common themes that arise from your presentations, and then most importantly, kind of hear from the audience. I think that will be the plan. I think it is really interesting, and I think it's also critical that both of your practices actually center voice as the kind of main, I guess, instigator of work. And I would say, I know that Ignacio mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, this kind of myth of authorship. Now we are beyond that, right? So I would say in both of your practices, actually, rather than the voice, the voices as the plural becomes quite important. So when Ignacio talking about kinship and alliances, and when you're talking about the notion of other or including the others into the project, I think these questions of how do we then begin to actually bring in the voices into our practices and kind of building of our built environment becomes quite important. So from there, I guess my question is how these ideas of actually voices begin to shape your practices for both of you, and then after looking at all these amazing projects for both, in AUR's case, I think one question would be through these amazing collaborations. There are relationships being formed, but then maybe the kind of sometimes the institutional aspects of it or the scales of the projects begins to actually challenge or interfere. Maybe some of the questions are actually for myself. So I think how does your project begins to navigate those? I think it would be the question. I think for IGG's case, the formats of these new alliances become quite important, in my opinion. And I think if you could kind of elaborate on some of the kind of new instruments for the alliance making, new instruments of kinship making beyond what we usually learn in architecture school as a kind of design, approaches and documents, I think it would be helpful.
Thank you, Nahyun. I'm pronouncing it right?
It's my sister's.
Thank you for your words. I would say for us, I'll just hit directly the idea where you're talking about institutions and working at the scale of the project and where institutions are involved and where they're not involved. Like, we are working on 2 projects currently. That's the same typology, but it's a very different audience. We are working on a tribal school in Maharashtra, close to Mumbai, an hour away from Mumbai, and where we are working with this not-for-profit. And at the same time, we're developing an international school for Manchester City in Calcutta, which is also a school. A lot of the functionalities remain the same, but the end users and the process of engagement is completely different. So for us to really understand the typology through these very different lenses, it's almost like you're working in a different typology. It's not the same school. So having a strong institution, it does help in execution of projects, I would say. So when things are at a smaller scale, where we are working with more grassroots organization, it is a lot more hands-on. There's a lot of responsibility, and sometimes, too much responsibility. But it's a great thing. But when there is a structure, it's easy to deliver a project. Like construct a project. So I think within the same typology, it completely changes based on if it's institutionalized versus its grassroots. I don't know if I answered your question or no. Yeah.
It's on? Okay, awesome. Yeah, I don't know if I understood exactly your question, but I think like part of what I'm interested in relation to voice and the formats of practice and kind of modes of design is how to operate through kind of fluid platforms of collaboration that dissolve the architect's voice. First, my own voice, because I always work with other architects. So IGG has never done a project alone. Like I have no interest in doing a project alone. Like I always collaborate with other architects, but those platforms of collaboration always include also other forms of expertise, other knowledges, and I tend to think of the different constituencies that are involved in the project as kind of part of the design. So clients they kind of are typically super involved in my mind, and I mean it's difficult to imagine the project of Willen's work without a person that has a very specific design interest and kind of is programming the space and to think of those figures as also bringing their own expertise into the project that adds to the design, so that it's not just that I collaborate with other architects and designers, but that I also collaborate with clients, with landscape designers that bring kind of specific expertise and understandings of the context for the last project that I showed, or thinking of other projects I didn't show, we did recently an exhibition design, and the curators were kind of critical to imagine the project. So all those collaborations, or thinking in more complex projects, like a project we did in West Oakland, to think of the different platforms of collaboration with people from EVALSI, the East Bay Asian Development Corporation, or David Peters from the Black Liberation Walking Tour that was our resident liaison with different kind of constituencies in the neighborhood. They were part of the project. They were involved in all the imaginations, but also to imagine projects that are almost bringing to the fore expertises that are kind of beyond that of the designers involved in the project. So that's how I understand architecture kind of being part of productions of kinship in the project itself, in the kind of design method, understanding design itself as a form of producing coalitions between these different parties. I mean, I'm repeating a little bit of what I said already in the lecture, but I hope, I don't know, if you have a more specific question.
No, I guess always, I guess, in this kind of question and answer discussion sessions, maybe there are some of the repeats, but I guess maybe also some of them are not necessarily questions, but comments. So I guess what I find interesting is what I can see, maybe you guys didn't necessarily present it explicitly, but I think there are almost like new modes of practicing, right? So then when let's say 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when we talk about collaboration is mainly with our peers. Maybe we talk about collaboration with engineers. Maybe we talk about collaboration with new types of client. But now we begin to actually talk about collaboration with actually people who will be using it, or actually trying to find the alliances or collaborators that are not necessarily even existing in the conventional sense, right? So when we're talking about more than human beings as collaborator, those are the beings that weren't considered only a few decades ago, right? When we begin to think about certain specific demographics or population. We talk a lot about labor classes and other populations, and those are the collaborators now. They should be the collaborators, but they weren't. So I think both of your work actually begins to, in a way, articulate ways to bring them into the project, and I think those are really moving moments in both of your work. So that's maybe the kind of the comments. And I guess maybe doing somewhat similar work. A lot of times the kind of ethical considerations, or how do we then begin to also make sure that our efforts actually begin to yield the kind of results of those collaboration, I think becomes extremely important. But of course, from your presentations, it becomes so obvious and apparent that those things are begin to actually yielding results or yielding kind of new influences, and I think those are really critical and important. Maybe the other aspects, like a little bit related to the title of the competition being New Practices New York. So we talk a lot about maybe new practices a little bit, but I think the New York aspects is also interesting, and not necessarily the New York as the city as one of the biggest city that everybody's in and maybe most popular, etc., densest, etc., with long history, but I think it is also very typical of being almost transcultural or diasporic constituents within New York, and both of you are, and I myself also, right? So we are in New York, and then we're grounded in the culture of New York in a very specific way, but you both are also grounded in the culture of where you came from, and then you operate in a translocal manner. And I wonder, what are some of the affordances from those conditions that the conditions of kind of bilocational, translocational, and transcultural provide you for to your practices for both of you?
Thank you, Nahyun. I think the biggest challenge for us is to reconcile the two worlds, right? And I feel that's a very good question, because that's it's both an intellectual challenge, but also a challenge of running a practice that is situated in New York and in New Delhi, where the economies of two places are completely different, versus in Europe, it's sort of in between in terms of that. So I think to reconcile, in the process of reconciling the worlds, I feel what we try to do is work on projects that could be similar in both contexts, but increasingly you can, it is really hard to do something that the body of work that we are creating in India and translating that, or either or vice versa, the residential work we are doing here. So what we are doing and is really working with the diaspora communities, because the museum that we are developing in Calcutta for the people of Indian diaspora, the indentured labor. So you have Caribbean communities in New York. We are in conversation about setting something up with a group to really understand these diaspora communities and understand diaspora spaces, from marketplaces to religious centers to places of normative living. We studied a lot of the factories and the housing, the barracks where their workers lived. And now as in New York City, it's not a melting pot, it's a mosaic, I would say. There's a map of New York that shows how each neighborhood has a high concentration of a particular community. So I think really understanding this diaspora in New York as a mosaic, and then developing something. For us, we are already doing that kind of work. And but what would that mean in terms of community projects? What would that mean for spaces of, like the language school? Like if it's the language school that we are doing in Glen Cove, if that was in New York City for a very specific community, and if kids of that community, but then what would it mean for significant others of the community? My wife is Chinese American. If she were to learn my language, she would go to that school too, or vice versa. So I think there is that duality of different different approaches that we can bring to the table. But what I'm increasingly trying to do is make it seamless between the worlds, two different worlds that I operate. But so reconciling that is the biggest challenge, and I think there are ways to do that through typology that you work on. Yeah, I feel that some of these typologies, if they can translate over to the work here, it will help us.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I've dedicated some of my kind of research and curatorial projects to think about precisely those concerns about like the modes of practice, but also kind of the pursuits of communities and individuals in relation to those diasporas. I did a big collective curatorial project, also collective, like everything I do, called After Belonging, which reflected precisely on those pursuits for building kind of communities and building relationships to places. And I think it's a project that was very much inspired by the five of us being kind of migrants in New York when we thought about that project. And I think like in thinking about my practice, I think that something that comes from that is the understanding of kind of contexts as being constantly produced and kind of localities being kind of the product of kind of design efforts, let's say, where kind of communities coming together and forms of kind of collective of collectivity are always the result of kind of work and not taking kind of the kind of forms of belonging for granted, I would say. And I think that working from New York, like when I go back to Madrid to do the project of that Blue House, for example, like looking at that neighborhood and looking at the way in which people have built community in that neighborhood, but also the way in which architecture is disrupting those forms of community building with these new forms of housing and trying to kind of participate in them, like looking at that context anew, like as if I didn't know how life in Madrid happens. It comes from this understanding of the kind of denaturalizing belonging, let's say, and its relation to place, let's say, and looking at the way in which design participates in either kind of constructing but also deterring forms of togetherness, let's say.
Thanks both for beautiful answers. Let's look at the time. Maybe before moving on to the audience questions, maybe one last question would be role of history or stories in both of your work. I don't need to explain, maybe reiterate again, but both of your practice, I think, engage the idea of different times in your case, maybe revealing or legibilizing the hidden histories, you being the historian and researcher of history. Also, I think bring in interesting kind of concept of how then this stories actually begins to affect how we form the built environment. So maybe if you guys could elaborate a little bit.
Thank you, Nahyun. I think, I mean, beyond the, I think that's a very relevant question for us because that's the central focus of the practice is to create this dialogue with history and not to create any form of mimicry, but to almost design things that if 1,000 years from now, if your building is in a ruin, along with everything else, that's the context, everything is in a ruin, will someone be able to stitch a story back in time with your project, with our intervention in middle, and then beyond to the buildings that came before us? And I think that can only be an attempt, but that attempt can only be successful if we really are cognizant of history, of hidden histories, of visible histories, of architectural materiality, as well as expressions, or historical expressions that could be, or any cultural motives. So I think history, and that's the more evident part of history, being addressing that. But then beyond that, we feel also a lot of social and environmental issues, a lot of it, a good understanding of those issues lie at an understanding of history. For a Sundarban project to really understand climate change, we try to understand it from a lens of history. And there are many writers who have written a lot of books. Amitav Ghosh has written about the history of the region that has brought about what we are going through, sea level rise at the forefront of that community. So we feel history is not only something that is palpable in terms of architectural expression, how the building comes together as a physical object, but also the hidden histories, as you correctly said, that are more about the stories of the people that influence what we are going to do, and how to sort of pull those stories out to influence us, and also influence the building, and the building influence the community. So, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's a great and difficult question because, as you said, like I'm also a professional historian, so thinking about those two aspects of my work is sometimes difficult. But I think that there are, I would say, at least three ways in which I find that I engage with history, or think through history for my design work. One is like to think how do we overcome the kind of legacies of hegemonic forms of modernism that have become prevalent, and that's where, like, for example, I'm always trying to kind of move away from kind of a redemptive impetus of modernism and its kind of attitude towards kind of, or its attitude of ideological superiority. I think I put it that way in the lecture, like thinking that in giving voice to other people, like there's kind of a vision that I can provide alone to them. And I think that that's something that has been important for me in articulating my practice more broadly. But there are kind of more granular ways of kind of thinking about genealogies in which I want to build with my work. And I was thinking, like, for example, on when I was talking about the relationship with clients and their importance in projects, I was thinking about Sally Swanson, for example, who was one architect that worked with in the 70s with many disabled folks in the Bay Area, where like many of the transformations of the environment that she did, like, passed to history, or to the small histories that I am writing, like as projects of their clients almost. Like her name gets almost erased, and I love that way in which the relevance of a kind of quote-unquote client comes to the fore. So that's kind of genealogies in which I've been thinking in order to model a type of practice. And then there are more specific histories for each individual projects that the projects want to kind of build on and advance and help empower, let's say, like in the case of West Auckland, building on specific architectures that are part of the history of the region, and that rather than kind of, again, appearing with kind of a redemptive role, the architect can build on, empower, kind of through different solidarities with those ongoing histories. So yeah, I would say that's those are kind of the different ways in which I'm thinking about that relationship right now.
Great answers. So now we're gonna open up to the audience. If you guys have questions, specify which speaker or to both.
Thanks for the really inspiring talks from both of you. Amazing work. Question for Ignacio. I was really compelled by the models that you showed. And I was wondering, the hyper detail is what makes it really unique, and the decision making. And I was just wondering, you know, it's like, in terms of the motivation for that, obviously it's like cultural artifacts and it speaks about the people, or it's like atmospheric, the parts are greater than the whole, or it's about engaging new audiences, or it's about maybe like expanding the work of the architecture, of the architect, or engaging in new ways of messaging, or all of the above? Or did you have like a particular like thought on this kind of hyper-realistic, detailed work?
Yeah. Thank you for the question, David. So, yeah, I've been thinking a lot about those kinds of modeling because I think it's all of the above, but like just to kind of outline like two main goals relate to both content and process, I'd say. Like, and I think that in terms of process, like the role that these models play as mediators of conversations, who is invited into those conversations, like as part of kind of what I'm suggesting, kind of these kind of larger coalitions that we want to build around the design process. I think their resemblance to kind of doll houses and things like that is kind of something that makes them familiar to many people and allow them to enter into the projects. But then it's also kind of more conceptually about how architecture becomes meaningful only in relation to specific environments, societies, programs, users that need to be represented. So like, we could have represented Gavin Green's case with a kind of more analytical forensic analysis of the distance at which his bathroom was located from that of his peers in the Gloucester High School. But we decided to represent kind of the corridor party life that he was missing, let's say, when he was going to that other bathroom, let's say. So that we understand that that bathroom, that kind of janitor closet retrofitted as a restroom for him as a transgender kid to use, is meaningful, not just as a technical artifact, but in relation to the kinds of communities, the uses, the parties that happen in a corridor, let's say. And that party needed to be represented in order for that other bathroom to make sense. So to understand architecture not as a technical, spatial, typological kind of construct, but as a kind of a mediator of all this other kind of forms of life and kind of thick contexts is important for these models.
And then I guess the other question for Agra is, do you work in model, or is it more computer model or drawing for process?
We do more. The process of the design process would be initially some writing and then sketching. I think writing comes first and then sketching, and then of course we some of the projects involves workshops. There is model making involved, but to be very honest, because of the sudden growth in the practice and the pace of the projects, we are really not able to keep up with model making. And that's a problem. You know, I've worked in other practices before, SOM, OMA, where the same issue would lie. When the deadlines are tight, you decide not to build a model. And that's what's been happening for some of our projects. But we love model making, and the process of making the model, you realize a lot of things that you wish to change. But I think to be very honest, we have to increase the model making from where it is, but it's modeling, sketching, and then just, yeah.
Yeah, us too.
Yeah. It's good that we have an exhibit like this, and we are forced to make two models to exhibit to show. I mean, the way you can communicate ideas through a physical model, it cannot be done through other means.
Thank you.